All right, are you ready to go live on YouTube?
Oh, hell yes. Let's do this.
Okay.
Hi, YouTube.
Hi, YouTube. If you can hear us.
If you can hear us, you're in for something. You're not sure what, but you're in for something. So you wanna begin again where we started before?
Yeah, just give me 1 second and
Okay.
I think that's a good beginning. All right, are you ready to go live on YouTube?
Oh, hell yes. Let's do
Sorry,
this.
we're just listening to ourselves here.
We are
Okay.
talking to ourselves.
Yeah, talking to ourselves. All right, let's do it. Okay, now we're live and recording. So, all right, what do you have behind you, Craig? What's that
All
background?
right, so this background is what's called the cosmic calendar, and what has been done is a compression of the 11 point and a half and however many odd billion years of the universe since the Big Bang into a 1-year calendar. So the pictures each represent kind of where you would be in whatever given month you're looking at, since they're things like the formations of stars and galaxies and things like that. And of course, when you're interested in Earth and human history, the Earth, which is about 4.5 billion years old, probably pops up somewhere around here. I think this is maybe the Milky Way being formed, our galaxy. And
That's which month is that when it gets formed?
let's see, that would be December, November, October, September. Looks like maybe August and September.
August.
Yep.
So it's pretty old. I thought it was like more recent. So it's actually
No, I
pretty
mean,
old.
the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and the cosmos is about 11 and a half, I think, or is it 4? I forget the number, but it's somewhere in that ballpark. So we are roughly, I think, third or fourth generation in terms of stars, right? Because stars are formed and then they grow old, and then they either collapse or go supernova or nova and things like that. And what we know, of course, is that the atoms, say, comprising you and me, were formed largely in the hearts of exploding stars in previous generations. So then you get to December here, and then you find human history is in the last few moments of December, and we're basically in the last second of December 31st, at the dawn of a new cosmic year perpetually, as it happens. And
So we're very, very, very new
we're
creatures in the
very,
universe.
very, very new and very, very young and very, very small as cosmic events are concerned. And yet we're important because, as far as we yet know, we're the only ones who can do the kinds of things that we can do, like, say, ask questions about philosophy and things like that, and use our thinking to understand how all this stuff came to be in the cosmos. So that makes us, not entirely unimportant, even though we are small. And we may sometime find out that there are those out there who have much greater and older and more advanced knowledge of things than we do, and maybe that we ever can do.
Do you think there are other civilizations out there somewhere in space?
I think the probability of it is quite high, sure, given the time and given what we see just with evolution on Earth, that wherever there's a slight possibility for life to come about in more complex forms to develop, it seems to happen. So yeah, I think there probably are. And one of the interesting things about that is, how long do those civilizations last? Right, there's a famous thing called the Drake equation, which is talking about how you compute how many advanced civilizations there might be in, say, our galaxy. And the last term of it is, how long does an advanced civilization last? And we have no idea. And of course, that question is of extreme importance to us because we'd like to know how long we're going to last. So it's one of those curious sets of questions that drive branches of science to ask the questions they do and do the research they do.
Yeah, I mean, do you think it's possible that other civilizations have existed in the past? I had never really thought about that on those terms. Like, what if there, even if there are no other civilizations out there right now
Mhm.
in the universe, but what if there were in the past and they just disappeared, because we've only been around for a very, very, like when you put it on those terms, we've only been around for a very short amount of time in the universe. So, isn't it possible that there were civilizations in the past and alien civilizations, and we just never, we weren't around to encounter them?
Well, absolutely, right? If we're at like third or fourth generation stars, that means there could have been civilizations developed on planets around stars that have already long since, exploded or burned out and things like that. And unless those civilizations found out ways to migrate to other worlds, they would be dying right along with their star, like we will eventually. And I think we got like about another 3.5 to 4 billion years on the sun's lifetime. So we
How
have
many?
time to figure it out.
3 billions?
Somewhere in there before, yeah, because there's the sun is on what's called a main sequence, and the main sequence is an astrophysical diagram that talks about the life and death cycle of stars given their size and temperatures and color and thing like that. And the sun is a fairly average star, so its overall lifetime I think is like 9 billion years, and we're somewhere over half of that now. And I
So
think
we still have a long time to go
in
before.
human terms, certainly, yeah. I mean, it's a long ride. A
Yeah.
lot of human generations will come and go before we need to make that choice. Of course, now we have all the various choices that are a lot closer that have to be dealt with. Things like obviously climate change and nuclear warfare, and for those who worry about that sort of thing, artificial general intelligence and what it will mean. So yeah, there are still plenty of existential risks, and of course, then there's always the threat of the asteroid or the comet that that could impact and wipe us out. And what we've learned is we can track a lot of those things, but we sure as heck aren't tracking all of them, and it will be the one that we don't know about,
Is that
that could get us.
is that a realistic threat? Something
So
like Armageddon, or what's the other movie? Deep Impact. Is
deep
that a
impact.
realistic threat, or is that like a Hollywood thing?
No, it's a realistic threat. It's just a highly improbable threat, right? But it isn't it isn't an impossible thing, but it is an unlikely thing. But we know it happens, right? We know there are plenty of impact craters on the Earth. We know what was maybe 8 or 10 years ago, the meteor in Russia that was tracked and caused some damage as it passed overhead. We know about the crater in Arizona, the 1908 probably cometary explosion over Siberia.
Well, how credible is it because I think from my limited understanding that they're not so sure anymore about the dinosaur like comet hypothesis that the comet killed the dinosaurs, right? They're
Mhm.
not really sure about it anymore. Do you know anything about that? How credible is that theory in
Well,
comparison
I
to
think I
years?
think the current running thought is it may not have just been the impact, it may have been other contributing factors as well. And that was like the fuse that went off and caused the bomb to explode. So,
Hmm.
there's the largest mass extinction, which is the one at the end of the Permian Triassic boundary. And Triassic, if you'll remember, you remember Jurassic Park. Well, Triassic
Yeah.
is basically where the dinosaurs started developing. but the mass extinction, what they call the Great Dying, that appeared there, and that was, I'm thinking 500, more than 500 million years ago. I'd have to look up the number, but that was caused, it is believed, by supervolcanoes on Earth that exploded, particularly the supervolcanoes once again located in Siberia that are called the Siberian traps.
What does that entail? Super volcano, is that something that still exists? And
Oh yeah,
how's that
Yellowstone
different?
is a supervolcano.
How's that different from a normal volcano?
Size, strength, the amount of stuff that it spills into the atmosphere. And the idea with a supervolcano is that it will force so many particulates and pyroclasts and things like that into the atmosphere that it will block out the sun, basically, and with no sun, yeah, everything dies in a pretty big hurry, except those things that have adapted, say, to live at the bottom of the ocean and, consume volcanic spew for food and
Is
things
that a
like
real possibility? Could that happen?
People, I mean, they're worried about Yellowstone, that Yellowstone is getting close to being due for an eruption. And while it will not have maybe the impact of the Siberian traps, it will do quite a number on North America, to be sure, if and when it goes. But again, it's one of those things that will happen. And in fact, inevitably it will happen, but it's low probability that it's going to happen like tomorrow.
Right.
But it's something that's being watched now, though, because people are getting concerned about it. I mean, the Earth itself is far more powerful than we are, right? When we think about how small we are.
Those mass extinction events, I think, because really the most of my understanding of it comes not from school, really, because I forgot everything, but more from Neil deGrasse Tyson and Carl Sagan, and but I haven't studied as much as you have, obviously, but I do remember them talking about, I think there were 5 main extinctions, right? How far apart are they in terms of millions of years? Is it millions?
Let me look that up here, because what we have are, let's see, the first one that wiped out about, and by the way, in geology, this is how they make geological eras, is they look at the fossils and they can tell when suddenly a bunch of fossils start vanishing, that there is some kind of an extinction event, and that's how they name the geological ages. So the first one that I see is the Ordovician-Silurian extinction event, and it looks like that is talking about 450 million years. And that was roughly 60 to 70% of all species. The second one was the late Devonian, and it splits the Devonian into the Devonian and the Devonian Carboniferous. I mean, the geologists come up with all these great names for things like that. And that one was at least 70% of the species there.
And when we say 70%, I mean, we're not a very good species to survive, right? I mean, most of the species that survive are probably a lot more adaptable and
probably a lot simpler, right? Because
a lot simpler. Yeah, I guess that's
complex species require complex things in their environment in order to survive. And if they get wiped out, I mean, it's hard to say about humans, because humans have proven to be quite, adaptable. And that's another reason that we are where we are. So I wouldn't necessarily, even extinction leveled events, I don't know that it will render humanity extinct. It'll just, kill a whole lot of us.
You think we could still survive somehow?
I think there is some minimum number of a few thousand, I think, to get enough genetic diversity. If those few thousand of people survived and ran across each other, because they're probably not all going to start co-located, you could probably start again, and you'd take however many thousand years it would take to rebuild and repopulate. So it's possible. So Permian Triassic, here we go. Here's the big one. It's about 252 million years. And that's very well dated. And those things tend to be dated by uranium, thorium decay and things like that. People, I think, have talked about, using carbon dating. That carbon dating is actually only good for like about 10,000 years. So you won't get data from that going this far back. So you need to go back to more serious radioactive elements like uranium and thorium and stuff like that. And the Permian Triassic, 96% of marine species and 70% of land species. So once again, you can tell evolutionary, man, we just get all these things keep getting wiped out. And you always wonder, what would have happened if more of those different species had survived? What would they have become given the opportunity? And would we be here? And the answer is probably no.
Probably not, right?
And then we get to the dinosaurs, and that's quite before the dinosaurs, we get the Triassic, Jurassic. And again, that's separating those two periods, and 75% of all species. And finally, the fifth and last one on the thing is called is the dinosaur killer, the Cretaceous Paleogene. I have not heard Paleogene before. We usually call it the Holocene, but and that was another 75%, and that was the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. So there you go. Yeah, those were the five. And there's a lot of speculation that we are currently engaged in a sixth thing, judging by the number of species which are disappearing, and in many cases are disappearing due to human interruption of the climate. So the proposal there is to say that we are now moving into the Anthropocene, so the human geological era, and that there will be some future geologists who will look at fossils and say, hey, all these ape men here wiped out all these other species. So that's us.
I did, yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I didn't really know that before I read, Harari's book, or books. I don't know if he talks about it in the first book, but he shows, he mentions all the studies that have been done. For example, in Australia, when humans moved into Australia, pretty much everything else died. Not everything else, but a very like high percentage of other animals perished during that period. So, and the same thing probably happened in other places. It's perhaps just not as clear because we've been around for a longer period. So, but we're definitely responsible for mass extinction. It's just that from our perspective, I guess it's caused by us, right? So we're the extinction agent. We're the comet, I guess, or the meteor.
We are the disaster that has sprouted on the rest of the earth, and I think we're the only ones who can do something about that. So
yes, absolutely. I mean, lions are not gonna save the planet, right? I mean, because they're not the problem. We're the problem. We're gonna have to figure it out. If we do, I mean,
if we can, for all I know, it may already be too late. I guess we can just hope that it isn't and try to do our best. But that's an interesting segue from where I originally thought we might go in this conversation. But it's pretty. And speaking of of Sagan, the calendar behind us, I think the first time I saw that was introduced by Sagan in the original Cosmos series back in that'd be the 80s, I think.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I mean, those shows are absolutely amazing. Some of the best shows I've ever seen. I mean, it's like, it's for you, it might not be quite as interesting because you already have a lot of that knowledge. But
that's how I learned it. So it was in fact, I have all 3 seasons of Cosmos digitally on my computer, and I was actually watching the first of the rewatching the first of the Tyson ones earlier today.
Yeah, those are really very, very good.
They are.
I mean, everyone should watch that, because it's just they should show it in schools, because
They should.
yeah, it's very key information
Key
for
information.
everybody.
They're also very humbling, and I think that's another thing as humans that we lack and could use some more of, is species humility.
Yes, absolutely. Uh, Also, they should show those documentaries, and they should show the BBC documentaries, Planet Earth and
The
Blue Planet.
Attenborough stuff, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
Attenborough should be ruling. He would be my vote for a philosopher king of the world if I had such a vote. I would say that Attenborough is right up there with the best humans on the planet.
I don't know much about him personally, but I've seen a lot of those documentaries, and they're fantastic. And I mean, again, key knowledge. Even if you don't retain most of it, like I don't, I end up forgetting it. But you certainly retain the I guess the very core ideas.
Sure. Yeah. You and
You
those are.
understand your place in a sense. You understand your place in well, in the cosmos sense, the universe, and in the life documentaries, you understand your place in the planet, and how little we are, but how destructive we are right now.
Particularly in many ways towards ourselves too, and that's
Well,
always
obviously,
kind of a puzzling thing, is how we are able to grow such intra-species hatred for one another because of very tiny variations and little bits of differences and luck about where you were born and what conditions you were born into and that sort of thing. It brings to mind one of the more famous thought experiments that was John Rawls, right? The veil of ignorance, right? Which is make your decisions, but do it assuming you are someone in very different conditions than the conditions that you are in. And would you make the same decision under those conditions? And that is probably his greatest contribution, and real important thought experiment.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about John Rawls except that book. I read the book and study it, and it's a great book. I mean, I don't know if he has any other contributions that everybody knows about, or not every. I mean, obviously, not everybody knows about John Rawls, but like the people that do know him, usually, I think, know him because
Well,
of that.
he's a pretty important political philosopher, and there are a lot of people who like a lot of his ideas. As with all philosophers, he has a share of good, healthy critics, and that is a key thing. I think I try to bring that up in our various Friday night meetings about whenever some kind of a theory or idea or whatever is presented, the importance of always going to dig up who the critics are of those things and understanding what they have to say about it. Because that's how philosophy, if you want to talk about progress, and if you have any notion of philosophical progress, that's how it does it, is ideas come up and then they are critiqued and refined. And in that case, it's kind of philosophy following a method not unlike the scientific, variations of the scientific method.
Right. Yeah. No, John Rawls is certainly, I think he's the most relevant or most important American philosopher, at least that I'm aware of. I mean, he's especially that book, Principles of Justice, isn't it? The name of the
A
book?
Theory of Justice.
A Theory of Justice, exactly.
Rawls' book.
Yeah,
There
that's a great
is
book.
another American philosopher then that I'll introduce you to, because he has just a marvelous quote here, and it's on the subject of kind of the definition and purpose of philosophy. And the guy's name was Wilfrid Sellars, and he was mid to late 20th century. I believe he is no longer with us. But he says the aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. And I love that definition of philosophy because, for one thing, it says absolutely nothing. It puts no limits. In fact, that's its whole point, is to remove limits. And that's something that has bothered me for ages about academia. There is the way that academia likes to slice and dice everything into departments and into fields and into subfields and into these deep
Right.
specializations that basically not only don't talk to one another, but can't talk to one another. And that just irritates me no end, because I'm a breadth guy rather than necessarily a depth guy.
It's almost like they take the approach of a factory owner and apply it to knowledge, right? You divide, compartmentalize, specialize, and produce in those ways.
And you reward for that kind of behavior. That's really the key thing here, is that if you want to become tenured faculty in any institution these days, but particularly the major ones, you have to do that. And that's why you see, like, when scholars reach towards the end of their careers is finally when you see them start to broaden out into other areas. It's one of the things like Pinker has done, like Dennett has done, like Michio Kaku, who is a string theorist physicist, has exploded into a little cottage industry. And that's what you find out, is that, people, these guys have always had ideas about broader reaches of things, but because of the academic system, you're kind of straitjacketed into what you can do and what you can say. And it's unfortunate.
That is unfortunate. And yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. It's an interesting thing to certainly to think about. So is that the definition of philosophy that you like the most?
I certainly love it. I mean, philosophy, right, means a lot of different things to just about everyone. Has probably their own notion of what it means. So I'm going to ask you it very quickly here to give me what your notion of it is. But I will simply at this point out that I think there are two main branches of philosophy, and they're not the ones people think of when they think of analytical philosophy and continental philosophy. I think of academic philosophy and public philosophy as the distinctions that I make. One of them is very technical and very specialized and not necessarily relevant to the world at large. And the other one is just the opposite. It's very broad, applies to basically everybody. Should have some kind of a personal philosophy, and hopefully something they can share with others. And so those are my distinctions, but I'm curious to hear yours, what you think.
Well, I do. Well, let me start by saying that I do like what you just said a lot, and I think it's very accurate. I think that yeah, continental, analytical, yeah, those are usually introduced as the two main kinds these days. But I agree with you. It's a lot more relevant to divide it into academic and public philosophy, because that's really much more more important division. I think that makes a whole lot more sense to me. For me, I mean, my definition of philosophy is pretty much non-existent these days. I mean, I change my mind every day, so I can't really give you. Yeah, I mean, so that's the honest truth. I mean, I can't really give you like a definition, but it's something that I'm not concerned about, and it's something that sometimes I'm very concerned about, which is paradoxical. It kind of depends on my mood, but mostly I would say I've settled on just to me, philosophy is just thinking about the world. That's kind of the way I see it these days. Mostly, it's just it's essentially the opposite of what you were talking about, academia. It's kind of like, to me, it's kind of the opposite of that. It's just trying to figure out, things about the world. And that is, obviously very, very broad, right? Because
Mhm.
that can mean a bunch of different things. I mean, I even here, do I have it here? No, but I was thinking about it the other day, and I wrote like the main things that interest me about philosophy. I don't have the paper right now,
Sure.
but essentially it was like different things, like to me, like thinking about politics, that's very much philosophy, thinking, unless you're thinking about like very specific, like almost provincial things, like for example, like Republicans and Democrats bickering at each other because Trump did that, or whatever, or Joe Biden is corrupt or not, or Hillary Clinton sent emails or not. I mean, that's not philosophy. But you know the political ideas are certainly, in my opinion, part of philosophy, because you're trying to figure out something about the world, something about society,
Sure.
something about man.
Sure. Absolutely.
And ethics is another part of it. But those are kind of like more traditional philosophical areas, because I went to school, and I mean, I didn't do just philosophy at university. I studied other things, and my official degree was political science and philosophy. So I was actually not just in one department; I was in two.
Okay.
And I enjoyed the political science department a lot more than the philosophy department. Even
Yeah.
though, to
Okay.
be honest, I enjoyed both. But the thing that kind of drove me not crazy, but kind of bothered
Mm.
me a little bit from the start was what you said. I thought it applied very much so to philosophy, and it didn't bother me so much in the political science department, but it did bother me in the philosophical department, that it was so, everything had to be defined and divided and compartmentalized, and that in philosophy didn't seem right to me, whereas in political science it makes more sense. It didn't bother me, but in philosophy it did bother me.
And it's interesting because it became that way basically in the 20th century, right? Before that, people were just thinkers and they would think about things and they didn't necessarily have to care about which pigeonhole that their thoughts would go into. But in the rise of the 20th century, with A, the population explosion, B, the explosion of the number of PhDs there were, because they were turning them out left and right after the Second World War. And a lot of those people, some of them could find work and some of them couldn't. They came up with that industrial type model that you're talking about, where the universities would basically become education factories. And the main problem with an education factory is that they kind of force everybody to try to think the same. And
Yeah.
when you come out of them, if you're thinking the same as everybody else, you have nothing to distinguish yourself and you have nothing really new to contribute. And that's how I find myself, 35 years after I graduated, in this position where I'm finally, because it's basically just been like the past 5 or 6 years that I've started thinking about giving a rip about philosophy. Before then, it was all science, this, science, that, science, everything else. And I've kind of come to the reasoned conclusion in my head that there are just questions that science doesn't answer very well. And you need to look elsewhere for those. And a lot of people look to religion for it. And I don't, because as I pointed out, I'm agnostic. I don't actually find evidence to say there is, and I can't conclusively prove that there isn't. So, you just go on and you fuddle and do the best you can in the world. But the great philosophers and world philosophers have not just in the West, have had a lot to say about this for most of human history, and they're worth paying attention to. Your turn. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, I was listening to you. I think it's interesting. No, I was just listening to you, and that kind of what I was thinking as well is that Actually, you were answering a question that I was going to ask you, which is like why you got interested in philosophy in the first place. You know,
Mhm.
so you were answering the question. I just didn't ask it, but so you were more interested in science,
Mhm.
but then you kind of saw that there were some things that maybe were missing, and you were interested in exploring those things as well.
There are plenty of gaps in our knowledge. In fact, there are probably mostly gaps in our knowledge. What we actually can claim to know may well turn out to be very, very small, like us on that December 31st on the calendar there.
Mhm.
And what there is to know is enormous, like the rest of the calendar. And one ignores the results of science at one's peril, but it isn't everything. It doesn't have all the answers, and it probably can't have all the answers. There probably will turn out to be fundamental limitations on what we can discover using those various methods. um, that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying, but we shouldn't
Yeah.
necessarily expect.
Well, and I think that like I've thought about this for a while, and I've I think science and philosophy are not that different. I think that they're not very different things. They're essentially
Not
the
at
same
all.
thing. The only
Right.
Yeah, the only thing that changes is really maybe the name changes from like natural philosophy to science perhaps, but they were already doing science and calling it philosophy before, so that shows you that in their mind it wasn't really that different. um and perhaps science is a little bit more specific. It has more of a what it's trying to find out. It's more specific. It has more of a clear goal, right? When you're trying to figure out something that is there, you know what you're trying to figure out, right? Whereas if we're talking philosophy in general, it can be anything. So by definition, well, if you're using this definition at least, it's never going to be that specific. Not that science is like super specific, but it's certainly more specific than everything.
Well, one pair
Uh,
of definitions in comparison that I've heard that I also kind of like is in science that you tend to know more and more about less and less, and in philosophy you tend to know less and less about more and more. And so one gets to infinitely
True.
small and one gets to infinitely large, and which in the limit, and which is better. And at the end, we find out we don't know much of anything about anything.
But yeah, and yeah, I agree. But at the end of the day, it's kind of the same thing. It's really
Hmm.
to me, in my opinion, is the same thing. It's just the big difference in my view is that you're studying different things. And if you really want to get into it, I guess the biggest difference would be the method, right? But even that I don't like very much, because the science has, the scientific method and all that. But in my opinion, like, I don't really understand why that's not philosophy. You can do philosophy and use the scientific method, if it's the right method.
Mhm.
And that's
Well,
kind of like what
it
drives
is,
me.
yeah, it is philosophy. And you find, I think, that most scientific practitioners do what they do and don't really pay that much attention to how they do what they do or why they do what they do. They're just kind of mimicking the behavior that they were taught from their teachers, and because it's been shown to work and because it's been shown to get you a job, and often a high paying job, they say, yeah, well, let's run with that. It must be a good method. But if you actually had them sit and try to explicate what they're actually doing, what method they're actually following, a lot of them probably couldn't. And that's okay, right? I mean, a lot of good science still gets done.
I think like when I talk to people, the people that I've come across, some people that the whole scientism thing, that everything that is
Mhm.
not done in a scientific way is worthless.
Mhm.
I think that's like a very stupid position to adopt, because and I'm sure they have their reasons, but for me, it just doesn't make sense. Like, what we're trying to do as far as knowledge is concerned, you're really trying to figure things out, right?
Yeah.
And then you have to figure out what the first thing you have to figure out really is like, what method are you going to use, right? You're not just going to use one method. And to me, it's very clear that there are simply some things that cannot be figured out in the same way you figure out, how old the Earth is.
Yep.
You're going to have to use different methods for different questions. And one method is very good for finding out things that are scientific, if you will, but that same method is not going to work for, like, if you want to try to figure out like love, what is love, like what people think about love, why people love each other, like that's you're going to need to, like, when you're trying to figure out like relations between humans, obviously it's not the
Mhm.
same thing as figuring out the relations between planets, right? So you use a different method. It's you need agility, mental agility. That's probably how people figured out everything in the world. People with a certain mental agility. When you get like really fixed on something that has been done before, or a certain formula, certain method,
Mhm.
that's not good thinking in general. You need some agility.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the great things, and I think Sagan talks about it in the original Cosmos, was Dmitry Mendeleev, when he came up with the notion of the periodic table. He actually had it in a dream, is how Mendeleev came up. And then he came up and he started putting out his little markers and developing the periodic table, and realizing that as you went down columns, or that things had similar type properties. He didn't know why, but he knew that they did, and that's how he arranged them. I think actually the history of ideas and the history of science and the history of technology, it's one of the reasons why those things are also fascinating, because when you start looking at the human elements in those things, you find out that how things came to be that we think are all true now, they came to be in really crazy and kind of absurd methods in a lot of cases. And that's absolutely fascinating to me. Newton's a wonderful
Yeah,
example of that.
that
Newton,
that
Tyson calls
that,
Newton the
that is
greatest
very true.
genius ever, but Newton actually spent most of his life working on biblical concordances to come up with end of the world predictions that were concealed within the Bible, and he was and alchemy. That was the other thing that he devoted his later life to. And so that great genius, by modern scientific standards, squandered most of his life on that, after he came up with his several really brilliant ideas in his youth.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. um Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson are very philosophical. I think, like, when they talk, they sound like philosophers. They sound like
Sagan
scientists, but they sound like philosophers as well.
Sagan does, and Tyson actually had a bad rap with philosophers for a long time, because he, like Hawking and Dawkins and Bill Nye and some of the others, really tried to downplay that philosophy even should exist and need. But Tyson and Nye at least have kind of relented from that position, because they finally read some philosophy, and that's part of the thing, is that trying to criticize something that you know nothing about is always a bad idea. Always a bad idea.
Einstein, for example, he was quite the philosopher as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Einstein and Pauli and Heisenberg and Schrödinger.
I mean, Descartes was mostly a mathematician.
Right.
Pythagoras as well. A bunch of the Greeks, actually.
Oh,
Um,
Pythagoras is another odd duck in
well,
history,
yes. I mean,
because
there's a lot
he
of
was not
strange
only
stuff,
a
but look, that
mathematician,
was
he was
ancient Greece, right?
yep, he was a religious cult leader as well, and
Yes.
their religious cult had some very interesting notions about things. In fact, a lot of Pythagoras was sufficiently similar to the ancient Chinese. There's actually been studies asking the question, was Pythagoras actually Chinese? Um, And I think ultimately the answer came out no, but there was similarities in thought that, raised the question. Is pretty another interesting historical thing. Great, because history has no end of fascinating things to bring up.
It's well, that's another thing that I think people should study a lot more is history. I think it's a very important subject, and it should be taught in a different way. Like people, I think history is a lot more useful if there's a degree of self-teaching. Like you need to figure out like things by yourself to a certain extent, and not like memorize dates. I think that
Right.
is like essentially useless. I mean, memorizing dates is almost like it's okay, 95% useless and 5% useful, right? Unless the date is a password of some sort.
Sure, sure. Well,
It's usually useless.
you
The,
bring up
the
two things I
important thing is
wanted to
to
talk
understand
about.
the chronology of things.
Yep,
I'm
exactly.
sorry.
No, you bring up two things that I actually have my list of things to talk about here if we have time. One of them is something. There's a reasonably famous British philosopher by the name of Gilbert Ryle, and Ryle wrote a book in 1949 about the mind, but he introduced two really good concepts in it that are probably the main things people remember about him today. And one of them is the concept of a category error. And he came up with this to try to discredit Cartesian dualism, was the point, in that he was saying basically Descartes was asking the wrong questions. And the prototypical example that he used of category error is guy came to his college and looked at all the buildings, and he saw the math building, and he saw the history building, and he saw the physics building and all that. And he says, I see all these buildings, but where is the university? I came here to see the university. And that is a point of a category error, because buildings are on kind of one level of, I guess you could say, abstraction. The university is on a much higher level of abstraction, and confusing those two things is the source of many kinds of errors, is looking at levels of abstraction. This is something I'm sure Frank would appreciate, and probably already does very deeply. So, and the other thing you brought up was
You
about
can
memory,
you,
but you go ahead.
you can share it. No, I was just gonna say you can share it with him if you want, so he
He
can
probably already,
listen.
he's probably already well aware of it, and I think probably Sashir is, and Kwan is, and a lot of other of the folks who have looked at those kinds of things in philosophy. The other one though that you brought up was about memory, and you strike a nerve with me here, because I have taken up the study of the art of mnemonics, which is how one goes about remembering things by creating visual maps in your mind, and then you associate things with them, and you make these sometimes very outlandish pictures to associate things, and thereby remember them, going through what is called the memory palace. And the memory palace dates all the way back to the ancient Greeks. A fellow by the name of Simonides used it. He was in a big dinner party in a hall, and he went out to, I don't know, throw up or use the bathroom or something. And there was an earthquake, and the earthquake brought down the building and killed everybody that was in it, to the point where they couldn't identify who the bodies were. But Simonides, being the mnemonist that he was, came through and went through from memory all the people who were seated at the banquet and the thing, and was able to reconstruct the scene from memory about who was who. That's the origin of mnemonics. And then Plato has, in one of the dialogues, talks about it. Aristotle has an entire book about memory that he wrote. It's an ancient and wonderful thing. I'm trying to use it to do things like memorize the order of decks of cards, memorize X number of digits of pi, memorize the periodic table. Those are the kinds of things, right? They're largely, useless information, but they're also good mind training information. And one of the things that you find as you get older, if you start getting concerns about your memory, I don't. I've always had an excellent natural memory, but that doesn't mean I don't want to make it better. And so taking up the study of mnemonics and memorizing, a lot of that useless trivia, hey, I'm all for it because it's good brain exercise.
It is I'm sure it's a good brain exercise. Yeah. I should do that because my memory is not very good. That's why maybe I don't like dates, because it's kind of difficult for me. No, but I mean, I honestly think it's largely useless, because really the important thing is for you to understand the chronology of things as far as history goes. When you get into like physics and ability to memorize formulas and periodic tables and all that, I mean, that's a lot more useful. But like this history as it's done in a lot of schools, you basically have to memorize a bunch of dates, that doesn't, they don't really mean anything to you. I mean, that's basically just a
The
waste of time.
individual dates don't mean anything. The order is what is important, what comes before
Exactly.
and after what, because then you can start to get some notion of cause and effect. Even it may turn out to be a false notion of
Exactly.
cause and effect, but at least it gets you thinking about it, and that's
You need
important.
The interesting thing about history is, yeah, you need to understand like what happened before and how that impacted what came after, right? And up until our days today, you understand the world so much better when you understand like how it came to be. A lot of the notions that people have are just simply false notions because they don't understand the history behind it. So
Right,
that's why I
and the
think
history, of course, starts with this calendar back here. Is you start by the history of the universe, and you start following that, and it's in all that in the 20th century. Again, that was such an amazing century for people putting together ideas about so many things, and that's why. Like when I talk to David on our Friday evening things and we talk about progress, and the question arises, has there been progress? And the answer is, well, yeah, obviously, of course. It doesn't take much looking around to say that there has been progress. But the other question that we asked was, is progress inevitable? And I think that's a very different question. And I think I have very different answers to that question than has there been progress. So
yes.
yeah, an interesting thing about the context of the kind of questions that we ask and how that affects the answers that we think we have to those questions. We can't, I don't think, necessarily conclusively prove that we have the answers to anything, but we can, express them in terms of likelihoods.
Right. And there are different kinds of knowledge. I think that's something that I try to think about a lot, or I actually think a lot, like try to figure out like what different kinds of knowledge there are, because there are for sure like two different, very, very different categories of knowledge. And one of them is the more exact kind, like science, for example. A lot of it concerns itself with things that also it's easier to get progress because it's about either it's true or not, and it's kind of either it is or it's not, it's a certain thing,
Right.
like, and it's concerned with laws that we cannot change, essentially. Gravity is something that is going to happen here, regardless of what you think of it. So it's just really trying to figure out something that it already exists
until it does, until they do change, right? Which they do from time to time, and
right, until it does change, but you know what I mean, right? So
yeah, but again, those are largely still boil down to assumptions and unprovable assumptions, because that's how logical systems work. I know this is an argument that I've had with some of the logicians in the group, is to make it clear that we have to, you got to start somewhere, and you start somewhere by assuming things, and then you start working out the conclusions of those assumptions. But then you go in and you change one of your assumptions and you get a completely different set of conclusions, or you can get a completely different set of conclusions. So it's all context dependent on what you start with. And we
Yeah,
all start in different places.
yeah, like a different way I could put it is like facts, like one type of knowledge is the knowledge about facts. For example, history is very much, again, it depends, but part of history is to understand the facts of things. For example, how did Julius Caesar die?
Mm.
Well, there is a fact, he was murdered and all that, so you either know that or not. You either know that piece of information or you don't, right? So you discover the truth in that way, and the truth is very linear, right? That there's a right or wrong answer. If you say Julius Caesar killed himself in a bathtub, that's the wrong answer, at least as far as all the information that we have point to the fact that he was murdered. So
Mhm.
that's something that it's either true or not, your answer, right? But there are some things, and a lot of philosophical subjects deal with those things, that it's kind of a matter of interpretation. It's more like an organization of knowledge, right? What is good and what is evil? You're never going to be able to find an answer like you can for that question, right? Was Julius Caesar murdered, or did he kill himself? There is a right answer and there's a wrong answer, clearly. Um, but with the what is good and what is evil, you're never going to be able to have that level of certainty, right? So it's kind of like a different kind of knowledge. It doesn't mean there's no knowledge. It
Mhm.
just means that it's a different kind of knowledge.
Well,
So I think that,
knowledge is provisional and subject to change. Even those things about facts are provisional and subject to change, which is why I would say, did Caesar get murdered or did Caesar kill himself? And I would say, yeah, it's probably 99.9% likelihood, but I'll leave room for doubt in there. And even there, I'd make an argument that, Caesar did kill himself by saying and doing silly things that caused the other leaders there
yeah,
to say he's got to go. And so he
yeah, but
ultimately
the
could be held responsible for it.
question is, but that's, I think it would be kind of like being escaping the question, because
Hmm.
that's not really, that's not really the question there. Uh, but so what areas of philosophy are you particularly interested in? Like when you got into philosophy?
Well, being, coming from a science technology background, that pretty naturally drew me there, and a mathematical background. So the kind of stuff that I've studied when I've taken classes are like philosophy of mind as it relates to artificial intelligence, philosophy of mathematics as it relates to the foundations of mathematics, philosophy of physics as it relates to quantum mechanics and particularly interpretations of quantum mechanics, stuff like that, but also philosophy and general culture that play on issues related to things like, what we talk about with the movies or the comic books, or things like comic books are great philosophical things because they're all little morality plays in essence. And if you follow them for a long time, and I followed them for, 50 some odd years, you can really see the progression in both the writers and in the behavior of the characters about some fairly important philosophical topics about it. There's a book out now that eventually I'm going to get when it comes. I can obtain it without paying full price. Let me put it that way. Called Avengers Infinity Saga and Philosophy, because I'm very interested to see about that and how they analyze Thanos and all that sort of business, because they're relevant questions to modern culture.
So so the book is a philosophical exploration
Mhm.
of the comic book and
Written by a
the
bunch of
movies.
academic philosophers in their spare time, writing the way academic philosophers often do, is taking it and breaking it down in terms of its historical precedents and things like that, and figuring out where it fits in the big jigsaw puzzle, I guess.
Hmm. Well, I think yeah. I mean, there's that was actually something that I was thinking about talking to you about, because you do
Mhm.
like comic books a lot, and you like sci-fi. So you find, but you're interested in pop culture. Also, you're interested in the kind of like the philosophy of pop culture.
Mhm.
So and and I am as well. Even though a lot of those things are kind of silly, but you can still have interesting conversations about those
I
things.
think
You're so inclined.
they're less silly. They're less silly than you might think. I think there is a fair amount of applicability actually to our everyday existence that can be mined out of those little gold mines. Even stuff like The Walking Dead. There is a The Walking Dead and Philosophy book in the same series, and this series has got like 100 some odd volumes about it that has things like The Simpsons and philosophy, and you name it,
Really?
it's in there. Yep, yep, and I
Never heard
have
of it.
a lot of them, hardly all of them.
What's the name of it's a
Yeah,
series of
hang
books?
on, and I will. Um,
You'll share it with me.
I'll give you some information about the series. Uh,
What's very
I think it's just called Popular. Damn it! Can I type? Here.
well, The Walking Dead was certainly something that I actually started reading The Walking Dead, the comics, before, a little bit
Oh,
before
sure.
the TV show came out, and I found it very interesting because at that time I was actually in college, and I was doing quite a bit of political philosophy, and
Okay.
when I was studying political philosophy, a lot of, at least in my experience, a lot of things go back to the contractual theory, um, in particular, like the state of nature aspects of it. Human nature. It goes back to
Mm-hmm.
Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Rousseau. And The Walking Dead is the way I was reading The Walking Dead, and I was very interested in it. But I kept thinking, well, this is a very good pop culture depiction of the state of nature. This is what would happen in the state of nature, right?
Yep.
So I thought, to me, that was very interesting from a philosophical perspective right away. And I even talked to people about it because I was so excited about it. It was a fun way
You're
to
not
explore the
alone.
state of nature. Yeah, in
So
a fictional setting.
there are a few different series, but they all tend to be something like popular culture and philosophy, or philosophy and pop culture. And there are 3 or 4 different series, but like the Walking Dead one is just called The Walking Dead and Philosophy with the subtitle Zombie Apocalypse Now. Um, and they all have different
Okay, so
editors in
it's
it, but
it's
they're
actually
all,
not just,
go ahead.
so they're similar series, but not just one.
Different publishers, different editorial boards, and that sort of thing. But so they'll have different styles with them. Like I like the Avengers and philosophy stuff. I like the Doctor Who and philosophy stuff a lot. Philip K. Dick and philosophy, Doctor Who, Star Trek. There are several Star Trek and philosophy volumes because all those things have interesting depictions of the human condition, and above all else, to
Yes.
be a philosopher is to be a student of the human condition, I think. That really is the prime motivation and the prime, right? Aristotle and others said philosophy begins in wonder. And then you have to ask, well, what is it that I'm wondering about? And so I'm wondering about other people. I'm wondering about the universe. I'm wondering about, can trees talk to one another, and do trees have intelligence, and do robots have intelligence? Those are things that I wonder about. And I'm not alone. Other people have wondered about them too. So
Well, science fiction certainly asks important questions about
they do.
technology, about the future. What well, in one sense, what are the things that we're going to encounter in the future? In another sense, what are the things that are particular to the human condition that are going to be exposed
Right.
by technological change? Which are, there's an overlap, but
Right.
two
Fiction
different.
in general are always kind of ask the question, who are we? And
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
and what do we
Exactly.
do when we get thrown into this set of circumstances? So that's one of the beauties of reading fiction. I wish I had more time to read more fiction. These days, I read relatively little fiction. Most of it is what I will see on, television or films or things like that. But because you can't do
Right.
everything. I'm catching up on a lot of nonfiction, trying to catch up on the history of philosophy, particularly global philosophy, because in the West, we have focused so heavily on the Greek and Roman traditions that there are a lot of brilliant things that come from the Far East, that come from India, that come from Africa, that come from the Native American cultures that just get obliterated and ignored, and you never hear about them. And if one loves wisdom, one can be open to whatever source of wisdom one can find it in. I like doing that, even though I don't read any of those languages, which is always a drawback, but it is what it is.
Yeah, although English is a good language because you get a lot of stuff that gets translated into English, right? So
You do with
you get
translation.
access to some of
One,
those things. Some of
yeah,
those things, not
you
everything.
just need, and I think Vladimir kind of brought some of that up when he's talking about is he's gone through his learning of English studies and things like that. But there are things that just don't translate well between languages, and it's difficult. It's difficult. That's why if you're going to look for a translation, it's always, I think, best to find 2 or 3 different translations of the same piece and kind of skim through them to see where they differ and what
Right.
concepts. If and obviously that's a time-consuming thing to do, but still it does
Yes,
pay off in the
it would
end.
be very time. And
Mhm.
it's often not even possible, right?
Right,
Because one translation sometimes.
right. A lot of translations of the ancient Chinese stuff all basically are people translating from the same translator rather than necessarily gleaning stuff from the
Yeah.
original texts, but not all of them though. There are some very good. There's a guy, philosopher by the name of Brian Van Norden, who is a Confucian expert on Confucian philosophy, but also on Chinese philosophy in general, who I would recommend highly. And a very eclectic guy, which is one of my things. I like eclectic. I like eclectic and I like pragmatics. Those are kind of my two. If I was going to be thrown into a philosophical pigeonhole, I would be an eclectic pragmatist, I think, which means I'll steal good ideas from anybody, basically, to me.
Well, that sounds like a good position to adopt.
I find it
So what are
helpful.
yeah. What are some of just because we're talking about this pop culture and the
Mhm.
intersection between pop culture and philosophy, do you have a particular I know you like the Marvel stuff. Is there anything in particular that you really like to read about in terms of like even those series of books that you're telling me about? I didn't know that you were so much into it.
I am.
Um, but are there
Um,
some things that are particularly interesting to you? I guess the Marvel thing, right?
well, sure. Marvel is up there. I mean, for me, Doctor Who and Star Trek would be big, and the Twilight Zone would be big things as well. But we'll talk about Marvel because that's probably more widely known.
No,
Captain
I mean,
America. Captain America
yeah, no,
is a
but I'm interested
wonderful
in knowing the other
character.
stuff as well.
Yeah, no, Captain America is a wonderful character to look at because depending on what philosopher is writing about him, you get, does Captain America follow virtue ethics? Does Captain America follow duty-based deontological ethics? And I've seen him presented both ways. And I've also seen some interesting critiques of Captain America because in some episodes in the comics, Captain America was not a very nice guy, much like as we see now with John Walker on Falcon and the Winter Soldier, where he's kind of gone off the rails. Well, at times, actually, Steve Rogers went a little bit off the rails as well during, and I think it depends on who was writing, the issues at the time. But it's a very, they're all interesting characters to watch the evolutions over time of, because much like the ship of
I haven't
Theseus.
started watching.
Okay, well, then I won't spoil anymore.
No,
Sorry.
no. But actually, I want to ask you if it's any good. If I should start watching it now.
If you liked the Captain America and the Winter Soldier film and the Captain America Civil War film, you will definitely like the Falcon and the Winter Soldier because that's the tone of these. Unlike with WandaVision, where the tone really was extremely whimsical to start out with, and then it turned really dark, and then it just kind of got confusing at the end. But I enjoyed WandaVision, and I enjoyed that they come up with a new version of Vision at the end of it. That will be interesting to see what they do with that going down the road. But Falcon and the Winter Soldier is very much although it asks some very interesting questions in it because they have time to do it. So the nice thing about these series is they have time to do stuff that you just can't do in a 2 or 3 hour film. You have to edit it out. Otherwise you wind up with, something like the Snyder cut of the Justice League that goes on
Have you seen
forever.
that?
I have, yeah, I watched it
Okay.
when it first came out, and I thought it was a much better film than the original. It was too long, perhaps, but it was a much better film than the Whedon.
Well, I thought we can talk about it a little bit. I think that that was a fantastic film. Actually, I thought that was a really good superhero film.
The first one, or
I didn't like a couple.
the Whedon or the Snyder?
No, the Snyder for sure. A couple of things that I was really surprised about was the first one was that it was a different movie. I think
Completely.
it was essentially a different movie. I wasn't expecting it to be a different movie. I was expecting it to be a different version of the same movie.
Right.
But
Yep.
I cannot say it's like, if someone asks me, I'll have to say, well, this is a different movie. It's a new movie. I mean, it has really nothing to do with the other one.
Yep.
I mean, there's a little bit of overlap, but it's essentially a different movie.
Yeah, no, well, Whedon was all focused and going on the death of Superman. That was pretty much his entire theme throughout that film. Whereas the second one was the growth and development of all these other hero characters, and particularly the ones that don't have their own films, and like Cyborg, and particularly they did.
A lot of that stuff is simply not in the first movie, right?
Not
I
at
mean,
all.
I don't remember it certainly being in the first movie, so
Yep.
it's completely new. We
Yep.
hadn't seen it before.
And it
So I
shows.
was very surprised and happy that I was getting a new movie.
Yep. And it shows in films about how much why the director is the one who is given the Academy Award basically for the creation of the film, is how much difference directors can make and that sort of thing. And the answer is complete 100% difference, especially when they're both storytellers, like Whedon and Snyder are. They're both writers as well. So
Yeah, and I think Snyder has revived certainly his career with this, because I think the Justice League got such a bad reputation, and that came after it's probably least loved movie, which is the Batman versus Superman, which, I mean, in
which I
all
think it's
honesty,
a
I mean,
bad
it's
I
not a
think that's a
great
bad
movie.
rap.
So He
Yeah, I
was
like
already.
Batman versus Superman, but sorry, I cut you off again there. I was
I
just saying
but
that
it's also
I
not.
liked Batman versus Superman. I thought they had some very interesting themes in it.
Well, I think you're right, but I also think it's now one of his best movies.
Hmm.
And there's a lot not to like about the movie. So I think, um, yeah, that already set him in a downhill path, and then Justice League kind of
Right.
like killed it.
You
Like
kind of
in Justice
wonder.
League was then people are like, okay, this guy has completely lost it,
Yep. No, you
and
kind
it
of
was
wonder in the
something that
back of
it
your
seemed to
head.
be the case, but now we discovered it wasn't his movie.
Right, right, exactly. And Whedon has kind of gone off the rails for a while now, and his career, I think, is in fairly jeopardy because he's said and done some very bad things to people, both within his films and
Yeah,
without. Which is too bad because he's one of those guys I used to
yeah.
thought had good ideas. Now I wonder in the back of my head though, I wonder what a Christopher Nolan version of the Justice League would look like, because that I think could also be and obviously it's not going to happen, but it'd be another interesting.
Well, I don't think it's impossible. I think there's a chance that there's a chance that it could happen. I mean, I don't think it's likely, but I think
Mhm.
there's a chance. I mean, he's a very he's a close collaborator with the studio with Warner Brothers and
Right.
DC. So I think it's not impossible. Also, he's a good friends with Snyder. If I yeah, I think they're pretty good friends, or at
Mhm.
least friends. They collaborated with each other
Sure.
quite a bit. I think that's how Snyder got the job, actually. Um,
So I'm trying
he
to think,
got
what is the next film in that series that's due? Is it The Flash or is it the next Batman film, which is kind of
um,
here?
well, the Batman is actually not in that series. It's like the Joker. They're making basically a separate version of the character,
Okay.
which is something that apparently the main character is very not the main character, the actor is very unhappy with,
Mhm,
because
mhm.
he thinks like he's being pushed aside,
Sure.
because now people want Ben Affleck back. I never thought I would say this, but apparently he's very unhappy with it. At least that's the rumor.
Okay.
But that's going to be separate. That's going to be a separate
I see.
version. So
I
it's not
see.
going to be in the same series, I guess. Not that it really matters. I mean, nobody really can make sense of the DC thing because it's so
They
convoluted.
really botched that.
Yeah, and it's very convoluted. And I'm a DC fan. There aren't
Mhm.
that many people that I talk with that will defend DC, that like superhero. Like a lot of people, well, the vast majority of people, it seems they're always saying, DC sucks. Marvel is great. I'm not of that opinion. I actually like their films, but they completely botched the whole shared universe for sure. I mean,
They
it's
did.
too convoluted.
Although the CW series, they I thought did just the opposite. I thought they did the shared universe very well in the CW streaming series of all of them, the Flash, Arrow, and
I'm not a big fan of those, but
aren't you?
but
Okay.
no, I like the movies a lot better,
Okay.
and I like the comics. I've always liked DC comics, and I do like the films. I love the
Yeah.
Christopher Nolan movies.
Oh, sure. No one's a
And I
genius, so I
yeah,
mean,
and I
yeah.
like a lot of these new movies as well. Even movies that people don't like. The only one that I would agree is really Justice League. I thought it was completely terrible, and the old version. In this version, I thought it was fantastic.
Okay.
A little bit too long, but
So
very good.
I have not watched Shazam, and I have not watched the Suicide Squad films. What do you recommend or no recommend? Thumbs up or thumbs down on those?
Well, the Shazam film, I think, is it's not a bad film. It's a good film, but it's very childish. I wouldn't say it's kind of like different. It's like a just good fun.
Childish, like say the Ryan Reynolds Green Lantern film.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, kind of. Except better.
better. Okay. Well, it's hard
Better
to be
movie,
better than that, but yeah.
but it's certainly not. It's not a very serious movie.
Okay.
And then the other one, Suicide Squad. People say it's a terrible movie. I actually think it's a good movie. I think the first,
The first
you
one.
know, it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's a decent movie. I mean, I found it enjoyable. It's certainly not a masterpiece, but I don't know why people disliked it so much. I thought it was pretty decent. The only one that I really didn't like was Birds of Prey, which kind of got good
Okay.
reviews, and I think it's because of the whole feminist angle. That's the only
Mm.
reason I can think that's why it got good publicity and people gave it good reviews. I mean, I thought it was pretty boring movie. I mean, I don't think
Okay.
superhero movies should be boring, but that was my opinion.
Probably not. Probably not. And then there was Wonder Woman 84, which I I really liked the first one so much better than Wonder Woman 84 because they spent so much time in that film trying to justify Steve Trevor. And I just thought
Yeah,
that, yeah, spent way too much time on that.
I agree. Yeah, I agree with that. Although I did like the movie, but I agree with you.
I
Yeah,
like
that
the
was
ending.
kind
I
of.
like the little tease at the end of it was
I
brilliant
like the
with
Pedro Pascal character. I think he was kind of cool, and provided it was like an interesting, like philosophical arc,
Mhm.
and the his relationship with his kid, um, which the only thing I thought a little bit weird about that is the kid was like apparently like he certainly didn't seem like he was his kid. He seemed like a different ethnicity altogether. I mean, I thought that was a little bit odd, but
Yeah, stuff
um
happens.
yeah, stuff happens. I don't know. They didn't show the mom, so maybe I don't know, but it doesn't really matter. I thought the character is really good, and I even thought the other villain
Oop,
was
you're dropping out some here.
was fine. You know, not as interesting, but pretty. I thought as good as the first one. I'm not sure.
So, when Black
Um,
Widow comes out in July, are you gonna go to the theater to see it? Or are you gonna watch it on Disney, or are you just gonna wait?
so ordinarily I would go to the theater, but the COVID situation. So
Mhm. Yeah, no, I'm
yeah,
pretty happy
so that's
to
gonna.
fork over the money to Disney Plus for the extra admission and just watch it at home. I think that'll be fine.
Yeah. Although I'm not really, I'm not paying for the extra Disney movies that come out on Disney Plus. I mean, I have the subscription, and
Ah, okay.
I'll take whatever they give me because HBO Max gives you the movies for free. I prefer that model. Actually, I'm very excited
Get you
about
that.
Mortal Kombat
Oh, sure.
coming out soon. Yeah, that's going to be a good one. So, but is there if you had to say like one superhero that you find particularly interesting, like from a philosophical perspective, which one would that be?
I surprise myself when I say this, but Captain America actually would be my,
Captain
and I
America.
did not like Captain America much when I was a kid reading the comics because it was like during the Vietnam War and things like that, and the whole patriotism thing was getting thrown in your face, like it sometimes is today. But Steve Rogers and his arc, particularly in the films, I thought was a thing of beauty.
Okay. Who do you agree with in the whole Civil War thing? Iron Man or Captain America?
Mm, they're both wrong, and they use that as an excuse to stage a superhero versus superhero battle, which is really what they wanted out of that film. But I
Mm-hmm.
don't know that I would necessarily agree with either of them in there. I, the notion of the Sokovia Accords was, in principle, a good idea. Cap, I think, is right in pointing out that the problem with it are the people administering it, not the accords themselves, but who's running the show and how much can you trust them? And I trust me more than I trust them, and I would probably be that way too if it were me. So
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a tough one, but I'm more on the Captain America camp. I think I don't really trust governments too much
Mm,
with like regulations and determining who's right and who's wrong. I don't think governments tend to be particularly ethical.
right.
Um, so
And they put so much of the
it's the
control
United
there.
States government,
Yeah, they put so much of the
honestly.
control of it all there in the hands of Thunderbolt Ross, who, of course, is a known bad guy
A
in the
villain, yeah.
comics. And of course,
Yeah.
it'll be interesting to see if they eventually transform him into the Red Hulk, like was done in the comics. Or not. Actually, the entire future arc of the Hulk in general is one I'm very interested in because of the upcoming She-Hulk series on the Disney Plus and where they go with that. She-Hulk was always a super interesting character, I thought.
Is that something you want to watch? I've never read a She-Hulk comic. Is that
I
any
mean,
good?
I'll watch all of them, right? Because I'm that way.
Yeah, that's true. That's
Um,
a stupid question.
but She-Hulk is a particularly, and if they can play her much like she is in the comics, because she's an attorney, and Bruce
Mhm.
Banner's cousin, and she gets
Oh,
transformed into.
actually, do you know the actress that's gonna play her? She's really good, Tatiana Maslany.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, she's the one from Orphan Black. Yeah,
Yes.
she.
Have you seen that show?
I have watched some of Orphan Black, and I just thought she was incredible.
Oh, she's
She really
fantastic.
made that series, and
In
so yeah,
fact,
it will be
yeah.
wonderful.
In fact, I wasn't very interested in She-Hulk because I'm not familiar with the character. But I mean, I am interested now that I know it's Tatiana Maslany because I really think she's fantastic.
Mhm.
Um, okay, maybe let me just ask you like one last question and we
Sure.
can think about ending this. But in the continuing with the pop culture philosophy thing, but
Mhm.
changing the genre.
Okay.
Um, what's one science fiction movie or TV show or book that you think is like um, I guess you can say either it's particularly relevant to us or maybe that you're particularly interested in, whatever you prefer, from in terms of the ideas that it explores.
Wow, because there are many, and if I had to
You can
reduce it,
give me a couple. You can give me a
if I
couple.
have
Okay.
to reduce it to the Star Trek family and the Doctor Who family are probably the ones that I still find most enjoyable. I don't know that I necessarily call them most relevant, but Star Trek constantly between the kind of crap episodes that they have every so often, constantly they'll raises some very interesting themes and questions throughout all the series, not just one of them, but all of them have. And I haven't watched Discovery and Lower Decks, so I'm going to leave them out of my questioning, but
Yeah.
the first 5 or 6 theories from the original series through Enterprise, they just raised some fascinating questions. Doctor Who, um, to me, raises interesting questions about physics and interesting questions about the human condition observed from an outsider's perspective, and there are parts of it that have made me cry. I mean, there are some very emotionally reaching episodes in there, and I like that. I like my art to make me feel things, and so when I observe art, whether it's through film or poetry or painting or whatever, it damn well better make me feel something, as I think that's the ultimate goal of art. And that's probably a subject for like a completely different conversation. So we'll
Yes, but
table that for
I'm
now.
interested. I'm interested in it, but I'm even more interested on the Star Trek side of it.
Mhm.
What are not? I mean, I guess because I'm not very familiar with Doctor Who, I've
Okay,
watched a
well,
little
that's
bit,
cool.
but Star Trek, I know
Sure.
I've watched a lot more.
Common ground, man. Common ground.
Well, yeah, I grew up watching the original series. I
Yeah.
actually haven't watched the other series. I
Oh,
watched
okay.
the original series quite a bit, and I watched the movies, all three of the
Okay.
new movies, some of the
Not the
old ones
10
as well.
first ones. Okay.
A
So
couple of the first ones, couple of the first ones, but not all of them, certainly.
if you like
But
stuff that talks about governments and insidious stuff within governments, Deep Space Nine is the series for you, because there are all these different, in a lot of ways, Machiavellian themes at play throughout it. And you get to see the Federation exposed as not the nice guys that they pretend to be throughout all the other series, and the lengths to which they will go in order to preserve themselves and whether they deserved it or not. So I would highly recommend for you with your interest, Deep Space Nine. I think the first season maybe not so much, but after it gets, I think there are 5 seasons, maybe 7 seasons actually altogether in it. But good series. Probably my favorite of actually all the stuff.
this is a very complicated and big question, but just to follow up on what you just said,
Mhm.
what do you think about this concept of human federation, especially if we do get to a future in which, not necessarily if we encounter alien hostile empires like the Klingons, because I don't think that's going to happen. It might
Right,
happen, I don't know, but
right.
in my opinion, most likely won't. But we are probably very likely, I would say, even, right? We're gonna go places and
Mm,
create some bases at some point, on the moon, Mars, maybe other
mhm,
planets.
sure.
So we're gonna see some sort of expansion scenario. And then, what do you think about that notion? Do you think that would be good? I think certainly the idea of some sort of world governance in the form of federation. That's one of the things that appeals to me the most about Star Trek. Actually, two things: that thing, the World Federation, and also the idea of exploration of new worlds. Obviously, that's the main thing, but that's very appealing to me.
All right.
Uh, so what do you think? What do you think about this idea of the human federation? And do you think it's possible? Do you think it's positive? How do you see the future if we do get to that scenario?
Sure. Here's how I think it's going to go. Um, there won't be a thing such as subspace communications, which means that as we expand out, um, talking from place to place because of the time effects, because of the speed of light and whatnot, you're going to have to wind up with a decentralized government, just because getting responses from big brother at home is just going to take too damn long to do anything. So I think you'll see highly decentralized governments. As far as exploration and colonization of the planets, my prediction for how that's going to go is that we'll get there and we'll build our little colonies there and realize they're not doing very well. And to overcome that, we're going to turn to genetic engineering. That basically they will start genetically engineering embryos on those planets to help adapt to those planets, which means, for example, on Mars, eventually what you're going to have there is you're going to have Martians, but they're not Martians who have been on Mars since the beginning. They're Martians who originated on Mars because we went there and we morphed ourselves into those kinds of Martians. And that will
Wow.
probably, and then the other question is what happens when we finally do find some kind of life, probably not necessarily very advanced, but some kind of primitive life. I haven't ruled out Mars yet, but the places now that are the hot spots to look at are the moon of Jupiter, Europa, and the moons of Saturn, Titan, and Enceladus. And if we find something there and it is drastically different than we are in things like, maybe it doesn't have DNA, maybe it has some other form of information and passing on, stuff like that. How is that going to affect us? And there have been studies by both sociological and actually religious institutions asking that question about what will it mean to the human race if when we discover life on other worlds. And I find that to be another fascinating question. I honestly have no idea. I think some of us will embrace it wholeheartedly and some of us will react very badly to it because that seems to be the human condition.
Yes, I agree. I mean, that's going to happen, but I don't know exactly the specifics. I would like to think that that will bring out our humanity a little bit more, but um, we also don't have that much time. I mean, if we're gonna make it, I think we need to embrace that by ourselves.
Mm.
Well, anything else you'd like to discuss, Craig?
Oh, there will be tons of things, but probably not today because you probably, my voice is getting tired, your voice is getting tired, and I need to go to the grocery store. So perhaps another time.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much, Craig, and I
Thank
hope
you for
whoever's
having me.
listening to us or will listen to us in the future, even in a million years from now, likes this.